What's cracking, y'all? You are now watching Boo TV. Appreciate you for stopping in. Like, comment, subscribe, hit the bell, stay notified, and let's get into the topic for today. What's cracking, y'all? Back with another Johnny Arnett reaction video. This is actually one of his older videos. I'm surprised I haven't came upon it yet. Published about 5 years ago. Destroying the myth that Michael Jordan dominated a weak era. I have never been a believer of that. If you want to argue that the 80s was tougher than the 90s, okay. But to say that the 90s was a weak era, I have to vehemently disagree with you. I am sorry. I'm sorry. I can't go there. There were a lot of all-time great players in the 90s. Jordan played a lot of tough teams in the playoffs and in the finals. He played a plethora of 60-win teams in his entire NBA career. And I'm pretty sure he has a winning record in the playoffs against 61 teams. That might be a video I put together sometime in the very near future, because I would like to tackle that. We're talking about Isaiah Thomas transition into the 90s. He wasn't some old, decrepit bat, right? Magic still had some of his prime in the early 90s left in him, right? Bird, due to injuries, phased out, but that's only due to injuries, but he was still damn good, right? Don't even get started on, the John Stocktons, the Karl Malones, who was a beast, Hakeem Olajuwon, though they didn't meet in the 2 times the Rockets made the finals in the 90s because Jordan was gone, but still, right? David Robinson, Patrick Ewing. The list goes on. There's a ton of great players in the 90s. Grant Hill, Anthony Hardaway. The list goes on, man. Shaq. I'll stop there. But anyway, and people like to talk about the expansion teams. Some of those teams ended up being very good pretty quick upon being established as an NBA franchise. The Orlando Magic, one of them, and the Charlotte Hornets, another one, just off the top of my head. The Hornets were established in the late 80s into the 90s, but probably around their 4th year, they were an adequate team, and then they had a really, really good season in the mid to late 90s, if I'm not mistaken. And by the Orlando Magic's 4th year, they were already a 500 ball club and quickly ascending each year after that until Shaq left. Miami Heat didn't really get good till the late 90s, and they might have had like 2 average seasons somewhere in the mid 90s. But anyway, either way, definitely do not think the 90s was a weak era at all. Also, it took Pippen years and Horace Grant to develop into the kind of wingmen and teammates and second and third options that Mike needed. Scottie was coming off the bench his rookie year. Come on, man. He had to cultivate these guys. He had to bring these guys along. They eventually got there. Let's get into it.
It's a narrative we've heard over and over again, often from people who want to diminish Jordan's legacy. The claim is that Michael Jordan dominated a weak era. He didn't start winning until Magic got HIV, until Bird retired because of back problems, and until the Pistons run was done. People assume that because Jordan couldn't win in the 80s, but then won in the 90s, that it's because the competition weakened. But that's an opinion that's severely lacking context. When Jordan was losing in the 80s, Michael was performing at an MVP level, but Scottie Pippen hadn't developed into a co-star until about 1990. Up until that point, Jordan was a lone all-star with a collection of role players going up against the super teams of the 80s. As good as Jordan was, alone he wasn't enough to take down a collection of all-stars like Larry Bird, Kevin McHale, and Robert Parrish, or a Pistons team with Isaiah Thomas, Joe Dumars, Bill Laimbeer, and Dennis Rodman. It takes a team to win in the NBA, and once Scottie Pippen developed into a co-star, the Bulls never looked back. There's also the narrative that when the Bulls finally broke through and beat the Pistons in 1991, it was because the Pistons had become old and the Bulls were younger. This is a bogus narrative that does nothing but discredit the Bulls' greatness. The Pistons' best player, Isaiah Thomas, was only 29 years old. Joe Dumars was 27 years old, Mark Aguirre was 31, Bill Laimbeer was 33, and Dennis Rodman was 29. Most of their best players were in the prime age of their careers, yet the Bulls were too much for them. At that point, we had seen the Bulls and Pistons face each other in the playoffs 4 years in a row. So although the matchup between the Bulls and Pistons was getting old, the Pistons certainly were not. The Bulls didn't start winning because the talent around the league had weakened. They won because a prime Jordan got some much-needed help that the other stars like Thomas and Bird had been enjoying throughout the 1980s. This weak era narrative doesn't just stem from Jordan's failures in the 80s, but it also comes from people discrediting the teams he faced in the finals throughout the 90s. So with that being said, let's break it down year by year, looking at each team Jordan faced in the NBA Finals. The 1991 LA Lakers. The 91 Lakers finished the year with the third best record in the Western Conference with a 58-24 record. They were led by a still elite Magic Johnson, who even at 32 years old, still put up his usual 20 points and 12 assists per game. James Worthy was his usual running mate, who was averaging 21 points per game over the course of the year. There was also quality supporting players like Byron Scott, Vlade Divac, and Sam Perkins. With all of that being said, this was not the same Lakers team of the 1980s. Kareem Abdul-Jabbar had recently retired, and both James Worthy and Byron Scott suffered injuries in Game 4 of the series versus the Bulls. Magic Johnson simply didn't have enough support to make the series interesting for Jordan and the Bulls, and the Bulls won the championship comfortably in only 5 games. In my opinion, this was the easiest opposition Jordan ever faced in the NBA Finals. The 1992 Portland Trail Blazers. The 92 Blazers finished the regular season with a 57-25 record, which was the best record in the Western Conference. They were coached by Rick Adelman, who was a respected coach around the league and an annual Coach of the Year candidate. Adelman won nearly 60% of his games over his career and regularly coached teams into being elite squads defensively. This Portland team was no exception, as they were ranked the third best team in the league defensively that year. They were obviously led by Clyde Drexler, who was in the prime of his career, averaging 25 points, 7 boards, and 7 assists. Clyde was the second best shooting guard in the league behind Jordan. Behind their superstar in Clyde, they had plenty of depth to back him up. Clyde's co-star was the point guard Terry Porter, who averaged nearly 20 points per game and orchestrated the team's elite offense. Terry was also one of the most lethal and efficient three-point shooters in the game, which helped spread the floor for the Blazers. At small forward, they had the 29-year-old Jerome Kersey, who just 2 years prior was averaging 20 points per game of his own. They also had Buck Williams at power forward, who was a walking double-double. He was the Rookie of the Year his first year in the league, and Buck was also one of the best defenders in the league at his position. Buck made 4 all-defense teams and was a 3-time NBA All-Star. On top of all of that, they had other quality and veteran players with experience, like the scrappy Danny Ainge, Clifford Robertson, and Kevin Duckworth, and each of those guys had made All-Star appearances in their careers. The Deep Blazers had a total of 6 players who averaged double-digit scoring that year, compared to the Bulls, who only had 3 players, Jordan, Pippen, and Horace Grant. So I think you get the point. This Blazers squad was absolutely loaded with talent, and although many of the names on that team have since been forgotten, it would have been absolutely ludicrous in 1992 if you had said their team was weak.
That is so true. Imagine these teams that they call them weak now. Back in the 90s, you wouldn't call those teams. What are you talking about? That's a very good point, Johnny. Very good point.
The 1993 Phoenix Suns. The 93 Suns had finished the NBA season with a 62-20 record, which was the best record in the entire NBA. Not only did they have the best record in the league and the league's top-rated offense, but they also had the league MVP. Charles Barkley was one of the greatest players in NBA history, who was just 29 years old and coming off of a season where he averaged 25 points, 12 rebounds, and 5 assists. Helping Barkley was an elite 26-year-old point guard, Kevin Johnson, who was a 3-time All-Star and had been on 5 All-NBA teams. Kevin Johnson, the energy and effort behind the Suns' season, and had averaged 18 points and 9 assists that year. On this year's Suns was also the recently acquired Danny Ainge, who crossed paths with Jordan a lot in the playoffs. They also had Dan Marley, who was one of the best wing defenders in the NBA at this time, and was also an elite three-point shooter who was chipping in 17 points per game that season. Add in quality veteran scorers like Tom Chambers and Cedric Ceballos, and what you have is one of the greatest teams ever to fail to win a championship. I'm telling you guys, this Phoenix team was incredible. They had absolutely everything, but it just wasn't meant to be. The Bulls were clicking at the right time, and Jordan had arguably the greatest final series of any player ever, as he averaged an incredible 41 points, 8.5 rebounds, and 6.3 assists over a hard-fought 6-game series. The 1996 Seattle Supersonics. This Sonics team was another nasty one. The 96 Sonics finished their season with a 64-18 record, which was the best record in the Western Conference, but was still overshadowed by the Bulls' 72-10 record. They were coached by a Coach of the Year winner, George Karl, and with the exception of Jordan's Bulls, the Sonics had the best defense in the league that season. This Sonics group didn't have a single player who averaged over 20 points per game that season, but they were extremely gritty and well-balanced. They had their prime superstar tandem of Gary Payton and Shawn Kemp. Kemp averaged nearly 20 points and 11 boards and was known for his ferocity and aggression around the rim. Payton was also averaging almost 20 points, was an excellent facilitator, and was that season's steals champion and Defensive Player of the Year. Then you had Hersey Hawkins, who was a quality scorer and spark for the Sonics, Detlef Schrempf, a 6'9 small forward who was a 2-time Sixth Man of the Year winner who was averaging 17 points per game that season. These are the type of guys that people don't remember, but who are the difference makers in playoff basketball. This Sonics team was definitely championship worthy. With their collection of talent and their gritty defensive identity, they really remind me of the 2003-2004 Detroit Pistons, who used their team effort to take down the super team Lakers. As worthy as the Sonics team was, no one was beating Jordan and the 72-10 Bulls that season. The 1997 Utah Jazz. The 97 Jazz finished the regular season with a 64-18 record, which was the best record in all of the Western Conference. The Jazz were the second best offense in the league that season, behind Jordan's Bulls, and they were also a top 10 defensive team. If you exclude Magic Johnson and Tim Duncan, then the 97 Jazz had arguably the greatest power forward ever and the greatest point guard ever in their starting five. Stockton and Malone were a dynamic, championship-worthy tandem on both the offensive end and the defensive end. Even beyond Stockton and Malone, the Jazz had plenty of depth that's been forgotten over the years.
I haven't forgot.
Like Jeff Hornacek, who was a consistent and reliable third option for the Jazz, who was one of the best three-point shooters in the league. You know this Jazz team was legit by simply considering who they had to beat just to get to the finals. In the Western Conference Finals, the Jazz defeated the Houston Rockets in 6 games. A Rockets super team stacked with Hakeem Olajuwon, Charles Barkley, and Clyde Drexler leading the way. This Jazz team earned their stripes, but the Bulls handled them comfortably in 6 games. 1998 Utah Jazz. The 98 Jazz had relatively the same strong roster and finished the regular season with the best offense in the league and a 62-20 record. The most significant thing that changed since the previous season was that the Bulls had weakened. Jordan was 35 years old, Rodman was 37 years old, and Pippen was 32 and had missed nearly half of the season due to his laboring back problems. Yet despite all of those disadvantages, Jordan still led the Bulls to win in 6 games over the Jazz for their second straight season. In that finals series, Jordan quite literally carried the Bulls as he averaged 33.5 points of the Bulls' 88 points per game that series. Now that I've recapped each finals team Jordan faced in the 90s, I want to make my closing point about generational talent. It's easy for the casual NBA fan to look at Jordan's competition of the 90s and criticize it because people simply don't remember the talent or weren't even watching at the time, so they don't truly know how talented those teams were. Think of the impact players in today's game, like Andre Iguodala, Steven Adams, Lou Williams, and Eric Gordon. These are just a few examples of talented players who are often the difference in wins and losses for their teams. But in a few decades, no one will be talking about these guys the same way no one talks about guys like Terry Porter, Dan Marley, Detlef Schrempf, and Jeff Hornacek. At a certain point, people won't remember the overall talent of teams, and it becomes just about the stars. The young casuals will say things like, "So Jordan and Pippen beat Barkley in the finals, big deal. What else did Barkley have?" A lot, actually. Heck, sometimes it's not even the solid role players who get forgotten, but sometimes it's even the star players themselves. A perfect example of a modern player who could eventually be forgotten is Paul George. Sure, he puts up great numbers and was even an MVP candidate for a while this year, but in 2 to 3 decades, people won't be talking about this guy. How do I know this? Because I've already seen it with guys like Adrian Dantley, Sidney Moncrief, Clyde Drexler, and Alex English. These were guys who averaged 25 to 30 points per game and carried their franchises year in and year out. But into the future, people generally don't talk about the greats who didn't win championships. So again, with that in mind, it's easy to see why people diminish Jordan's competition in the 90s, because when Jordan was playing in the 90s,
they wasn't winning.
He was the only one winning.
Yeah.
And those are the ones we remember. No matter how you try and spin it, the reality is that Michael Jordan led a Bulls team that dominated an era of legitimate and fierce competition that many people just simply don't remember or just never knew. Thanks for watching my video, guys. Let me know in the comment section how you grade Michael Jordan's competition in the NBA Finals.
Spot on analysis by Johnny Arnett. I don't disagree with anything. I've never thought of it that way. How he made that comparison, like certain players just get forgotten, and even the stars do, the ones that don't win, which makes it easy for us to forget about the people Michael Jordan was slaying, not just in the finals, just in the 90s period. Regardless if they made it to the finals or not, because they didn't win. So they're forgotten about. Charles Barkley's popular right now. I could tell you this, if it wasn't for Charles Barkley recreating himself, reinventing himself on TNT, I promise you, he would be just like Clyde Drexler. He would be just like Shawn Kemp. He would be just like Patrick Ewing. These guys that people forget despite him being so great, but because of his personality and his second career in broadcasting and on TNT, you know, people, that's put him in the face of the camera, and now people can attach his NBA career to his broadcasting career, and he's mentioned, and he's not forgotten. But I promise you, he will be forgotten like all these other guys have been. I haven't forgotten about him. You haven't forgotten about him, but the others. Anyway, that's all I gotta say about it, folks. Hop into my Michael Jordan playlist, check out more content just like this, and I will be doing my own little created video on Michael Jordan and 61 competition, shall we? I catch you on the next one. We out, baby.